Would libertarians be sad if we got rid of national parks, alphabet agencies, and the military? Are unions actually free market? Is it fair to compare taxation to slavery? We'll discuss these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the entire internet, or as much as we can at least, and we gather as many takes as we can see, ones that are good, ones that are bad, and we give our opinion on why they are good or bad. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie, and before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, all that good stuff. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first one is a tweet from a user, and it reads, "Libertarians get all excited about no taxes until they realize there would be no national parks, no military or Coast Guard, no FAA, USDA, FTC, CDC, National Forest, no interstate highway without toll booths every mile, no free police and fire department, etc., without taxes and fees." Yeah, as a libertarian, Donnie, would you get upset if we eliminated those things?
The funniest part of this, I saw a reply that was, "Don't threaten me with a good time," and it's funny because most of these things are features, not bugs. Like when you look at things like no national parks, private owners of land are actually some of the majority that provide parks and access, and on average take care of the land better, take and manage forests and public access points way better than their state counterparts. And when you talk about like I don't know why they randomly brought in Coast Guard, but it's funny to me to think that there wouldn't be some kind, for any sort of practical purpose that the Coast Guard might serve as far as shore safety or help or aid. Like there'd be no services that a community would pay for that kind of thing, or that industries would want, industries that rely on water travel and water commerce, that they wouldn't have some kind of agreement to pay for those or whatever. Obviously, the FTC has been an absolute nightmare through the COVID, and the CDC has been a COVID regime has been a nightmare. And then the highway thing is funny because the first thing is like, oh yeah, I'm sure no one would be able to figure out a method where you wouldn't have to stop for a toll booth every single mile or whatever. I'm sure that there would be no economic incentive for private actors to make their roads more appealing or anything like that. But then also, like when you go to the East Coast, like the tolls there are insanely high.
Yes.
They're crazy.
They're everywhere.
Yeah, like I think of tolls as being kind of bad and how they're implemented near where we live, because they've done a lot of bait and switch things where they'll build a bridge and say this toll will go away once the bridge is paid off, and then they'll be like, hey, do we want to renew this toll so that it can go fund other things? And it's not a new tax, and people fall for it every time, so then you end up with cheap stuff like that. But this is crazy because like you go to the East Coast and it's like a $20 toll, and it's everywhere. It's wild. So again, in the words of Larry Sharp, the dystopia you're describing is now in many cases, and all of the good benefits we want. So honestly, like I don't think any libertarian wouldn't get excited at any of those prospects.
Yeah, the "don't threaten me with a good time" is a good way to put it. Like, especially because they're talking about libertarians, right? It's like, no, libertarians want no taxes so that like the best actors can come in and actually provide these things. As you've always said, just because you do away with taxes doesn't mean that the people that care about having a national park or being able to provide a highway or preserving some sort of natural landmark, those people don't go away. They're still around. They still want to make sure those things are there, and they will find a more efficient way than the government distributing the money to do it. I was down in California for a conference a few weeks ago, and my wife and I went to a redwood park, and it was really cool because we were reading about the history of this redwood park. I think it was like 2,000 acres, a lot of redwood trees in it, and it was actually bought by a private business owner. I can't recall his name right now, but he bought it because when he was exploring out in that area, he ended up staying the night inside one of these redwood trees. He was like, wow, this is amazing. And, I've bought it. And the traditional sense to get revenue from like this whole area would be to log it. He's like, I think I could like charge people to come here to like see the tree that I stayed in and stuff like that. And so he did that for a little bit. And then he ended up actually being like, hey, I'm going to turn this over to another person to manage. We'll still have like a little like cabin and stay on here that will fund it. And he's the one that actually ended up preserving that entire park, and it's pristine. It's an awesome place. They actually do a good job making sure that there is, in terms of fire damage, I think it has the least amount of fire damage of all the redwood parks in the state, simply because they do a good job of just letting everything do what it's supposed to do. They do proper forestry. They make sure all the brush on the ground like actually gets burned up or is taken away. And so that's a private person that fell in love with an area and is doing a better job and has done a better job managing it than the government could ever do. And then it's a no-brainer, right? With the military and Coast Guard. I mean, I don't really know much about the Coast Guard's infringements on liberty, but I kind of lump them in with the general police and military state. But we would love for the military and Coast Guard and police state to all go away and be replaced with private actors that have incentives to actually satisfy the needs of their customers. I mean, I don't think anyone is happy with the police over the past 3 years. If you're a lefty, it's because you've seen all the types of violence they've enacted on people. And then if you are conservatives, I mean, it's kind of a wake up call to realize that there is no law that these guys will not enforce, no matter how unjust it is. I mean, they were the ones that were shutting down your businesses when the governor said that they should shut it down, even though you disagreed with it. So, these guys are not, the police in general is not a good thing. There are good police people and people that I know, but those things that are undesirable are, like you said, are a feature, not a bug. So without taxes and without fees, someone is still going to fund it because someone still wants it, right? It's kind of like the argument about school choice. It's like, well, if you give parents the ability to choose where they want to put their kids, why does that automatically mean the public school system will go out of business because they won't have students? It's because if parents given the choice would not choose to let their kids go to the public school system because it's so terrible, so they'd actually fund someplace else. That's the benefit of incentives, is that the right money goes to the right people at the right time.
That's exactly right. I think that that's a really critical point too, is that not only is it a better distribution in terms of who's going to receive the benefits, or who's going to, step up to the plate, but like we recognize that because we're realists when it comes to economics and human action and stuff, every policy decision you make, whether that's through a government, or the abolition of a government, or removing a government feature, program, department, whatever, there are going to be winners and losers, right? There's
Yeah.
going to be people who benefit and don't benefit. And that's kind of why these departments are made in the first place, right? They're made, the idea is in order to benefit everybody, but in reality, because of the way that, life works, it will benefit some people and it will not benefit others. And as is the case with most things that are done by force and things that are done by coercion, there is a smaller group of people who are doing the coercing that get the benefit, and there's a larger group of people who pay the price for that. So, yes, there will be some people who right now do not have to proportionately pay for the services they are receiving at a cheap, like, and if you remove this, government function, they will have to pay more for the thing that they are receiving, and it will be a worse deal for them. But when you think about it in reverse, it's like, okay, so why then is it the responsibility of other people who aren't benefiting from whatever, you know, features the department offers? Why do other people have to pay for a benefit they don't receive at all in order to subsidize the cost at which someone who is receiving those benefits pays? That doesn't make any sense. And so it's always like, wow, well, let's say for the sake of argument that national forests, let's say that they did go up, like every public park now, you have to pay a small fee to go in. Let's say like every single public park in existence now has like a $5 entry fee for like a family or something like
You
that.
still
You're saying,
kind of have
wow.
to do that, which is
Right. Well,
crazy.
yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Let's just pretend though that, like, for the
Sure.
sake of argument, that everyone that is currently free and accessible, you now have to pay a nominal fee to join. And you're like, dang, that really sucks for people who are using those parks every day. But the way that taxation works is that it means that everyone is paying those fees right now, even the people who live miles away from that park, who never get to go there or who don't have any reason to. So, sure, on the one hand, it's like it's unfortunate for the people who use that service, but it's even more unfortunate right now in the status quo for the people who don't get any of the benefits and are still paying. And that's the thing about taxation, is that it always punishes everyone, regardless of how much they pay. And that's why taxation is inherently sort of this socialist idea where everyone has to pool in money and only some people get the benefit.
And in your example there, revenue for a normal private business, revenue determines which voices you listen to and which changes you make within your business. And to kind of flip it on itself, the way it currently is enacted, the people that use the park and the people that never use the park, they all pay the same amount. and they also have the same amount of voice in what happens to the park and how it's run and what sort of things and events and other sorts of stuff goes on at that park. So you actually have a disproportionate voice of people that never use the park, have no vested interest in using it, can also vote to do things that people that do use the park don't really want to have used for. So it's the worst of all worlds, because if it was a normal private place, right? Like if there's a private business or a private entity owns that park, charges people to use it, they don't care about someone that lives 10 miles away that never wants to go outside, what they have to say. They only care about the people that are visiting there. And so it not only dilutes and makes it unfair for everyone financially, but it also dilutes it for the people that do want to use it as well, right? It results in a worse service that is not as concentrated and not as effective. And so that's kind of the key to any sort of incentive that you have, and that's why it's so important for a free market, because these signals help people respond to things in the proper manner that maximizes the amount of good, fun, enjoyment, productivity for everyone. And without it, you're not able to do that.
That's a excellent point.
All right, moving on to our next one, we've got Lauren Southern. And she writes, I've never understood the conservative disdain for unions. When a multinational corporation comes in and puts every local shop out of business, it's all hell yeah capitalism. Yet when workers band together to ensure they're compensated correctly, free market, hello, it's bad? What do you think?
So the pile on replies that I saw that she then immediately conceded to, which is correct, is that most free marketers don't have a problem with a voluntarily formed union of people who want to band together to negotiate. The problem is when there are government backed unions, or when there are sort of coercive unions that get formed that make requirements and demand. Now, of course, if it's a private union and you're required to join as part of being hired by the company, that probably doesn't exist, right? Because the company itself would have to sanction that, and it's not usually in the company's interests. So most of the time, not always, most of the time, unions that are mandatory to join have been government backed from the beginning, and those are the ones where the real evil creeps in my opinion. And so, like, you know, there are private unions that, again, that basically require membership. I don't love that because it is also a consolidation of power in a sense, in that you're taking out options from and workers and stuff like that. And I think that usually what ends up happening is there usually ends up being some kind of a generally government backed system where it might be a private contractor or a private company like a construction company or something like that, or some more like electricians or things like that. But the government won't hire them for their projects unless they are union specified or whatever. So there's this disproportionate government impact to want to require unions in that way against the employer the company, excuse me, the company's wishes. So there are some perverse incentives there sometimes for private unions as well. But the majority problem here is coerced joining and coercion to begin with, because a union that represents its people will have no problem attracting people into it. I think one of the biggest myths out there is this idea of the freeloader, the person who doesn't pay the union dues but gets all of the union benefits, and that's just not really an actual result that you see in the real world, because when unions negotiate their benefits, they usually negotiate them for the union members themselves, and if you're not a paying member of that union, you don't get those added benefits. Your name isn't in that collective bargaining association. And so that of course is not this that means that, like, as a union you would want to represent your people because you want people to join, you want them to pay the fees, so that you can have negotiating power, and that way you are kept in check by the people you represent. But when it's a mandated government backed union, then you have all kinds of disproportionate incentive structures that are not at all aligned with what the people who are part of the union necessarily want. You have political spending that's going towards causes that many of the union members don't even like or want, but in order to keep their government job, they have to keep it, which is just crazy and insane. So there's a lot of problems with government-backed unions, but also in private unions, I think there are government incentives that add a level of disproportionate, like they tilt the scales basically, so that you don't actually have sort of a free voluntary association. You have a heavily manipulated by taxpayer dollars choice there that ends up not really being a real choice.
Yeah, and we've done a show on like monopolies for companies before, and essentially like absent of government intervention, a company that wants to maintain a monopoly will have to consistently offer the best product in the market at the best price that no one else can match. That's the only way a true monopoly can be sustained without government intervention. Of course, we have tons of government intervention. We have tons of crony capitalism, and so a lot of companies are able to maintain a somewhat less than optimized product at a higher, price, and well beyond after they've taken over and run out all the small businesses. So the key, obviously, in that is that we like it when a corporation comes in and offers really amazing products at great prices. That is capitalism. In order for them to keep that, they'd have to maintain those prices, and that's the only way they can keep other people from coming in and intruding on the market. In the same way, we are also for workers banding together, because I would even say we're for overall labor market banding together, because the signal that employers can give is that, hey, we want to attract really top tier talent, so we're going to pay more. That's what you do, absent of any government ceiling or price floors for labor. That's what companies can do to attract or discourage having labor that they want to have. The aspect, though, that becomes, like you were saying, is that when a union is mandatory to join, usually enforced by the government, or if it's not mandatory, there are elements of coercion and force and violence that is used to back that up, which you and I would call crime, right? Like, that's just
Yeah.
wrong. I don't think anyone likes crime, including conservatives. And so, I remember we had a mutual friend in college who worked at Safeway in the produce section, was not a part of the union, but when the union went on strike, he was like, I could technically go into work today, because I'm not part of the union. But if I did, I had another buddy who went in and then his car got all smashed up, by the time he returned outside. And so a lot of times these unions will use force and violence to make their point and to enforce their will upon people, which I don't think anyone in their right mind that loves peace, that loves voluntarism, that loves freedom is for. And so that's obviously bad. But in general, unions, like you're saying, like you and I would agree that in a true free market vacuum where people are truly able to make their own choices, free of coercion and violence and things like that, then yeah, that's great. I came from the construction industry, and the HVAC technician union here in Washington State is actually fairly good. Like, it's a good way to the benefit it offers the workers is that the workers are somewhat protected. They have some sort of collective bargaining with these companies, and the companies are incentivized to have a union technician because those technicians are provided training that is superior to someone who is not part of that union. And so a lot of businesses that have life sciences, that have really technical equipment that need to be worked on, will only work with a union company, not because they're like a pro union per se or pro labor, but because they're pro, hey, this is almost like a certification that this person is a really good worker, that is, they're a really expert at what they work on, that everything is going to be safe, taken care of properly, and that our equipment that is life critical is going to work. And so when unions function that way, where they're both providing a service not only just to their members, but also there's an incentive to the business to use them, I think it's the best of all worlds. Unfortunately, because a lot of them are mandatory use force, we don't really get that optimal result.
So to point out again why a way that happens, right, is like, let's take that good example that you provide with the HVAC, right? The problem is something that the reason why you're going to see so much sort of anti-union rhetoric and policy from conservatives, or just generally freedom appreciating individuals, is that the government again steps in and ruins everything. Because a great example is the government in Washington state wants to, I don't think they actually passed a bill this last legislative session, but I know they were talking about it at the very least, make the kinds of trainings that you're talking about for all kinds of different sectors mandatory,
Hmm.
so that you have to get licensed in those, and then make the license that you get only offered by the unions, right? So rather than it being a measure of, hey, this union offers really good and superior training, it becomes, hey, the union is the only way that you get the training that gives you the certificate that makes it legal for you to work in the state. And so then the unions are it's not, hey, you don't have to join the union. It's just, in order to work legally, you have to have this training. Oh, how do you get the training? You have to join the union. So it's a backwards way to get around the Janus ruling, which ruled that workers have the right to opt out of public labors. They find every way they can to get around the Supreme Court ruling. Um, and that's one of them. And so yeah, so in that case, the of course the incentive structure for the government is that unions then pay for pro-union politicians to stay in office. They support their campaigns, they donate to them, and lobby on their behalf. And so then you see this with like teachers unions and things like that, where there's just this absolute machine of political power that's concentrated in these unions because they have these mandatory fees that are paid by people who may not ideologically agree with them, and then they can use those towards political ends. The only other thing I will say too is that the unions themselves, the culture of unions. I think you kind of touched upon that a little bit with the Safeway example. The culture of unions is not inherently conservative or respectful of private property, as you mentioned with the car smashing example. And just another Supreme Court case just came out where they ruled that, yeah, if workers strike on site and they cause damage to the company's equipment, then they are liable for that. That is not, that's not part of their sort of striking rights. And all of the articles are talking about a major blow to union rights, and it's like, no, this is a major protection for private property. Because look, it is true that you as an individual have the right to stop working if you want to leave a job or whatever. That's fine. If your contract says you have to work a certain thing, then maybe you've breached contract and you have to figure that out. But just as a general rule, yes, you do have the right to stop working for an entity or an individual. But in a similar argument to what we might call the Tom Woods yacht example for abortion, which is if you invite someone on your yacht and then halfway through the cruise decide you don't want them on your private property, you don't have the right to just eject them into the ocean, even though you own the yacht, because you've had responsibility there. In the same way, just because you have decided you want to stop working or you want to strike or whatever, you don't have the right to drop, the equipment you're using into a magma pit and destroy it just because you're like, oh, nope, I'm not working for this job anymore. You have a responsibility because you've taken the equipment that is not yours, that's you're not your private property. You have a responsibility to do the best that you can to return that to its condition before, and return it to the owner. And so that's what the Supreme Court basically upheld, and people were mad about it. But that's crazy that people would be mad about it. And I think it shows the general union culture, which is not one of respecting freedom and private property and a mutual sort of, we're doing this in order to set us a fair wage and a fair standard. It's almost just like we're going to spite the business owners. And that's also kind of a not super conservative. And again, I'm not any lover of massive corporations, don't get me wrong, but private property rights are private property rights. And what can happen to the biggest individuals can happen certainly to the smallest of businesses as well.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next one. We've got Nina Turner. She writes, reminder, advocating for things that are free at the point of service is not the same as advocating for slavery in any form. Firefighters are not enslaved. Teachers are not enslaved. And this tweet is, of course, coming on the heels of her tweeting out that insulin and healthcare should be free. And then the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire tweeted back that, something not so nice, but basically saying, equating that to slavery. What are your thoughts on this tweet?
It's funny because this kind of take is very common, where people will assert, hey, remember, this isn't slavery, this isn't the same thing. And then you ask them why. Like, you can see a lot of the other like libertarian parties, I think like Libertarian Party of Connecticut was asking, like, okay, at what point, if you tax 100% of wages, that's slavery. What about 50%? Is that slavery? What about 30%? Is that a third slavery? And the funny thing is, all of these kinds of tweets is just, hey, reminder, this is true. And they never back up. They never justify why that's the case. And the thing is, like, firefighters aren't enslaved in the sense that they are doing this against their will, because that's not the claim we're making. The claim that we're making is that involuntary payment would be the slavery aspect, right? And so if you are saying that firefighters have to firefight regardless of payment, then that does become
Yes.
slavery. And so you just have to look at it at the flip side. And taxpayers are being asked to pay for that service regardless of whether or not they are using it or want to opt in for that. So that is coercion. That is a form of slavery. And so it's like she's taking the formula, flipping it into an example that we're not citing, and then making just the blanket statement, hey, this is not true. doesn't actually do the work of describing why, and like I said, twist the initial example anyway.
Yeah, the firefighters and teachers and government employees that don't create anything necessarily, but are providing a point of service, as she points out, they are the recipients of whatever type of resources that are being taken from people involuntary, which you would say are slaves. And like uh, the the argument, as you pointed out, is at what point of and what percentage of your labor being taken from you involuntary does it become slavery? Obviously, we all agree that if 100% of your labor was taken from you and given to someone else and it was not your choice to do so, that's slavery. But what happens at 90% or what happens at 50% and what happens at 20%? And then you start to realize, like as Lysander Spooner said, that it's not really a difference in kind, it's just a difference in degree at that point. And so, these firefighters and teachers, all the stuff that goes to support them, all of the, if you think about just like money and funds and value as something that is like energy to be transferred from one person to another, these people are receiving it from someone. And that means if someone is not paying for it and they're not voluntarily doing it, it means it's being taken from them. And that's wrong. That's not good. That doesn't make it any better, right? It's like, as Rick and Morty talks about, it's just slavery, but with more steps, within it. So yeah, Nina Turner hasn't thought through it all the way, and I think she's made kind of a nice Twitter following, tweeting these things out and causing controversy. But every time someone does this, just kind of think about the actual endpoint. Where is the actual energy? Where's the actual value that is supplying and making these things possible coming from? And if it's coming from a source that is involuntary and is not actually being chosen to, or they're not actually choosing to fund it, then yeah, it's probably wrong. It's not ethically correct. There was no consent in it. There was no voluntarism in it. So it's not good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, like, think about it this way. Um, if she was trying to make this claim about firefighters not being enslaved to do their job, say, okay, what if they didn't get paid, or all of the money they made went towards a service to pay for something they didn't want that to do, right? That would be enslavement, right? Just because you've earned money and then you get a service back for the money you earn doesn't mean it's not slavery if you have no freedom to say how your revenue is being spent and earned. And so that is how, for instance, when we say like 50, 30, whatever percentage you want of taxation is a form of slavery, that's how that's going, because that is money that is being taken from you and you have no freedom or say in how that equates. And so people like Nina Turner will gleefully say you own your own labor, but as soon as that labor actually translates into, a token, right, a fiat currency like the dollar that represents that labor, and then that labor is taken from you and put towards something that you have no say in, how is that not slavery?
Yeah.
It's like saying, okay, look, you'll do firefighting because you've said you're a firefighter, that's great, but let's for 2 hours of every day, whether you like it or not, you're actually going to come in here into this government office and you're going to do tax work for 2 hours a day every day. And it's like that would be called slavery because you have no say in it. And it's like, as long as you are employed anywhere, as long as you work for any company, you have to do that. That would be considered slavery because you have no choice. The employer that you are hiring has no choice but to force you to go there and do that. But just because you put a couple of extra steps in it, like you mentioned, it dilutes the message enough for them so that they think, oh, well, it's not your labor that's being taken from you. It's not your freedom or choice that's being taken from you. It's the cost of a civilization or whatever they want to claim.
What's funny is we don't apply this sort of thinking to any other, not to any, but there's what's weird is the types of services we apply, the thinking of like, well, the free market can never provide this. We don't really apply that to food. We don't really apply that to internet or a lot of things that we just kind of just say, oh yeah, we just go to the car dealership to buy a car or whatever. Uh, but for some reason, the free market couldn't figure out how to pave roads, between businesses, or the free market doesn't have a vested interest to have some sort of service to make sure that your house doesn't burn down. There's already a lot of free market options for education. You and I both being recipients of, homeschooling and curriculum built for homeschoolers, as well as I think you did like private school at some
Yeah.
point?
Hmm.
Yeah, so private school and all sorts of ulterior, alternate methods of education. So a lot of things that we think could only ever be provided by the government, like there's other things that are not provided by the government that would make more sense in a lot of ways or would be a stronger argument, but because they're not, because they're better served by the free market, as all things are, like we just take it for granted and it's just like, oh yeah, that just functions that way. Everything that the government provides, the free market could provide as well, and it would be voluntary
Absolutely.
and ethical.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a series of tweets. So we've got Dave Smith originally tweeting, the level of hubris from the national security expert class is mind boggling. Quote, national security expert. Not even getting literally every decision wrong over the last 20 years, costing millions of lives and trillions of dollars can give them pause as the condescend as they condescend to the rest of us. He misspelled the or they.
Ah.
Tom Nichols quote retweeted is saying the quote national security expert class, despite its mistakes, has kept nuclear war at bay, defeated a brutal empire in the Cold War, secured a global system of trade and cooperation, and made it possible for comedians to complain about it all while living in peace and freedom. And then Gene Epstein, which this is the take that we're critiquing, replies, just for starters, the national security experts ran the risk of nuking the world to establish the principle that we and we alone have the right to put nuclear missiles off the border of another country, slaughtered millions in Vietnam, and did nothing to, quote, defeat the Soviet Union. What do you think? Is Gene right?
Gene is absolutely right. One of my favorite things about this is he talks about, we defeated the brutal empire in the Cold War, and it's like the security experts were the ones who didn't who wanted to prolong that, who didn't, and it was like, one of the best things that Reagan did was he sat down and talked
Yeah.
with Gorbachev, and actually brought peace, and the national security experts were advising against that. They were mad that he was doing that. And so it's like, you know, you're trying to, even the one like good thing that you can, like, one like cognitive, or it's not cognitive, excuse me, the one cognizant point that you're making there, you can't even claim, because that was the antithesis of the national security experts. And of course, the other funny thing too is like saying kept nuclear war at bay. It's like, what are we doing now? What we're doing now is literally escalating towards that. You're saying, like, hey, we didn't blow up the house, so we did a good job watching it. Never mind the broken glass on the ground from all the windows we smashed. We didn't burn the house down, so it's okay. And so yeah, so Gene Epstein's absolutely correct. Um, in saying that, like, just because that the bad thing didn't happen didn't mean that it was because of the national security experts. They ran the risk of nuking the world, and then also just highlighting a lot of their other failures. So just the absolute arrogance of these people is unreal when you look at their track record.
It, did you ever watch the movie Mouse Hunt growing up?
No, I don't think so.
It's it's your example of like the house and just them rampaging through it just reminds me of that movie, because basically these two brothers buy this really old house they're trying to remodel, and there's this mouse that they discover, and they're like, oh, we got to get rid of that, obviously. And in the process of them trying to get rid of it, they end up destroying the entire house, but they end up kind of getting the mouse, which is good for them, but the whole point of what they were doing just destroyed everything around them. And so that's very similar to what's going on, like you're saying. It's like we have provoked, in the effort of making the world a safe place, we've expanded NATO to Russia's doorstep, literally right on their border, and then put missiles, within launch distance of Moscow, and then, funded with more money than they spend on their entire military in a year, funded the Ukrainians, right on their doorstep to fight. And it's like, yeah, we're kind of provoking and prodding and kind of not, like you're saying, knocking out certain aspects of the foundation. Like, hey, if we drop this wall, maybe we'll kill this mouse. It's like, well, yeah, you probably will get something that you want. Maybe you will get Vladimir Putin, but maybe on the way out, when he's, this crazy person, that can't be reasoned with, so there's no point in sitting down with him. Maybe this person that we're provoking and backing into a corner maybe decides that he should launch nuclear weapons because he has no other choice. So a lot of their logic for every decision they make, they just adapt and change based on the goal that they want, which is just more and more war, more and more money going over to someplace else that actually comes back here to the military industrial complex. The other
Yeah.
part, oh, go for it. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just gonna. I thought you were gonna.
You're
I was just
agreeing.
gonna say the other aspect, of course, being that, like, with Russia, like, part of the reason we had the Cold War going was because we said we weren't going to join NATO, and we weren't going to expand NATO. Excuse me. and now that's the whole thing we're doing right now is they're going back and trying to expand NATO. So like that's just another really one of those contradictions. It's really funny.
Yeah. I like the one of the parts that Gene didn't address, which I thought he might, given his kind of economic background, is we've secured a global system of trade and cooperation, and I think about like the first thing I thought about was like, yeah, that trade and cooperation. Like, how does that sound whenever a country decides they want to go off, the petrodollar? They no longer want to use it. Like, you think about like Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Libya or any of these places. Like, oh yeah, we roll in and we destroy everyone there if they're not doing what we want them to do. So yeah, it's cooperation through force. Literally the Empire in Star Wars saying like, if you don't pay this stuff, we're going to stick the Death Star on you. That's literally what we do. So yeah, none of the stuff that Tom Nichols has said in this is true, and Gene is absolutely right. Like the cooperation and the peace that we've provided, it's only peace if you equate that with killing millions of people and forcing people into subjugation across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, but absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. All right, moving on to, I think, is this our last one? Yes, it is.
Yes,
All
it
right.
is. Yeah.
So we've got, which one did you want to? I'm assuming Christopher. F.
Yeah,
Rufo?
yeah. We'll talk
Okay.
about the Chris Rufo position, generally speaking, here.
Okay, cool. So John Stossel tweets out, here's our full interview with real Chris Rufo on fighting woke ideology in schools, why Rufo's critics say he invented the conflict over critical race theory, forced DEI training, why I call some Rufo and DeSantis methods authoritarian. That's John Stossel. And Rufo quote retweets and replies, I appreciate John Stossel, but these policies are not, quote, authoritarian by any stretch of the imagination. Legislators have a fundamental right and duty to shape public institutions. Regulating pornography and race hatred in public school classrooms is not authoritarian. The Stossel argument amounts to the absurd conclusion that the people, through their elected legislators, do not have a right to regulate their government. This is tyranny in the false guise of liberty. What do you think?
So, to give maybe a little bit of background and context for people, what a lot of this is Rufo advocating for things like laws that would prevent legislators or others from um, allowing specific materials or books or content to be taught or shown in schools. Some that would be considered pornographic, some that is like diversity, equity, inclusion training that is sort of inherently racist and things like that. And I think, you know, the more that I think about this and go over this, the more I'm inclined to agree with Rufo over this. But it depends on maybe some of the specifics of the action or of the policy. But when you think about it, like the idea that the government class, I mean, I guess my bottom line, my thesis is kind of like this is why public schools shouldn't exist, and this is why government meddling in this is a problem. Is because you have to have this idea, you have to serve the idea of complete equity or complete equality of ideals and treat people equal under the law, which isn't like inherently wrong, but that's where it gets really muddy, right? Because you know the idea is the government should be a completely neutral arbiter of these kinds of things, and education should be taught from a neutral perspective. It shouldn't be able to say like this ideology is right or this ideology is wrong. But the more you think about it and the more you realize there is no neutral when it comes to the government and when it comes to their perspective. They're always going to have some level of what is defined as acceptable and what isn't, and that is true both in a qualitative, what is your value perspective, but also just from a what is the purpose of a school, right? So, because it's like, for instance, if you set up public schools and then all of a sudden you had, instead of teachers teaching classrooms of like math and English and history, you had, a teacher saying, all right, we're now going to go and literally just play tag all day for 4 hours. We're going to play tag 4 hours a day. And they were doing that 5 days a week. You would say that's not what school's for. This like that's not what a high school is for. That's outside the purpose. I have to make a qualitative judgment that this falls outside the purview of what should be allowed for a school to do. Now, of course, if it's in service of some kind of other education like PE, you can talk about defining what is or isn't. But even when you're talking about the scope of what a school is supposed to do, you have to narrow a purpose. And the more that I think about it, the more that like a purpose and the values therein like are more linked than not. So you think about like, is it appropriate, for instance, for a school to teach kids like womanizing, for instance, like being a pickup artist for girls on the street to sleep with them and then leave them? No, that's not appropriate. That's outside of the purview of what a school should do and should. But that's also kind of a value judgment, right? Because if you were to say, should the school have a woodworking class? That would fall within the purview. They're both technically a skill set. One just has more of a value connotation and is seen sort of outside the scope of what is acceptable, and the other is seen kind of what is acceptable. So all of this long rant to say that again, it depends on the specific statutes and limitations, and I don't like giving the government power to define these kinds of virtues or ills because they're always going to be used against them. But I would also say that right now, if you have a government system, you have to have that government system allowed to be able to enforce its own limitations and its own purviews. Otherwise, it will be replaced with an ever increasing progressive ideology anyway.
Yeah, and this is where the messiness of, I mean, we've talked a lot about like taxation and how that provides incentives and weird signals in the market kind of, and it screws up everything, in this episode. Like this is where this really comes into play, right? Because on a fundamental principle level, we don't like legislators making ideological decisions. But the problem is that we have a public school system that you and I are taxed for day in and day out. I just get my property valuation back and I see how much they're levying on it. It's like, well, shoot, I'm paying a lot of money for this. And eventually, even though I'm not going to send my kid to it, when my kid comes of age, I'm also going to be footing the bill for my kid's education that I've chosen, as well as the public school education system. And so, in a long enough time span, I could see being like, well, shoot, because I'm forced into this, I should at least make it into something that gets me some benefit, right? Or at least mirrors the cultural values that I desire for. Because you don't have that economic signal where I could withdraw my money from the public school system, because that's the proper signal to tell them what type of value judgments are appropriate. That's the proper value signal to say, hey, carpentry should be taught and womanizing should not be taught. Because if a school started teaching womanizing, then no one would send their kid there. And then the school would be like, oh, crap, we got to actually do away with this. But because we don't have that signal, the only way to actually send that is through legislators. And that's why it's. I mean, I'll have to go watch this interview, I guess, and figure out why the arguments he makes about them being authoritarian. Because to me, at face value, it does kind of line up with what Rufo was saying, that it's tyranny under the false guise of liberty. Like we should just be helpless. It's like, well, no, you've got an authoritarian bully on your doorstep demanding money, and also simultaneously taking a survey about what they should do with that money, and they'll cave to popular to whatever the popular vote is. So it's like, well, why would you not kind of start to make steps towards having a better society in that way? It's not like you can change it right there all the way to what you'd want. This perfect anarchistic, free, loving society, but maybe making these little incremental steps over the long enough time horizon, you could. So yeah, I think it's a good take by Rufo. I'm not really familiar with most of his other takes, but to me, the logic in this is, or maybe the logic I'm reading into it seems fairly solid.
Yeah, Rufo is really in the sort of conservative wing of like people who appreciate liberty, but also maybe are a little more populist and like want to use the power of the state back. And so I'm always hesitant to wholeheartedly agree with, that route. But I think his point here is correct when that is the, like you mentioned, like we don't have that economic signal. This is the only metric that we have, the only use case while this exists for it to make any kind of change. I liken it to what Dave Smith has said, which is like, I would rather there not be public parks established. I wish they were privately owned. But if public property exists, I want the public property not to have a drugged out, crazed homeless person attacking my children there, right? Like I can think that it's not right for the state to own public property, and also think that if the state owns public property and that's the world we live in, they should take that person off the street, right? They should make it a safe environment for my kid. And that's kind of the situation that we're in right now, where it's like, yeah, I don't like the idea of public schools. I think public schools always are going to lead towards a society that promotes government intervention, that promotes government as the virtuous thing, and government as the ultimate good, and will teach that as an ideology. However, we live in a system where that is the case. It's not a matter of giving the school the authority to talk about worldviews and talk about, what is the official religion or not, because that's the dystopia is now, to call back to Larry Sharp. And so it's like, if that's the case, then yeah, I do want the schools to be prevented from going into the scope of what I would say is, teaching the secular religion. It would be just as absurd to say that, well, we can't ban the schools from teaching like that child sacrifice is correct. We can't ban them from that, because then they'll have the authority to say that, I don't know, like that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And it's like, yeah, when they're making a qualitative statement that child sacrifice is good, they already have the power that they want. They already have the authority to make those kinds of qualitative calls. And so at this point, you have to rein it in somehow. And if that's using the power of the state to curb the power of the state, then so be it. It's not a perfect solution. We don't live in a perfect world where we get to do everything by, on pure principles. But the idea is you have to rein it back and hold it back before you can dismantle it and abolish it completely. I don't think that the end result is would be a good solution that would be like a public school that teaches all the values I want it to, and then you force everyone, because I think that ultimately, again, deteriorates. I think ultimately you want that gone. You want a free society with good, strong cultural values guiding that country. But that's not where we find ourselves, and you have to always operate where we find ourselves now. And so in that case, I think it means if you can't abolish the school, which you should, but if you can't do that, then let's rein it back. Let's tell them, no, you're not allowed to actually tell a child that because his skin is white, he's automatically racist. No, you can't, show children who are under the age of 5 books that teach them how to have sex. Like, that's just inappropriate. That's wrong. And that's outside the purview of what a school should be doing.
Yeah, it's almost the difference between strategy and tactics, right? Like strategy is your long-term goal, it's where you're trying to head. It's the ultimate destination, and the reasons why you're going there. And then tactics are the concrete actual actions that you're taking to get there. And it doesn't necessarily fulfill the strategy all at once. It takes a lot of those successful execution of tactics to get to that. And to me, from a libertarian standpoint, I don't think Rufo would necessarily agree with this side of it. The strategy, the long-term goal is that we live in a free society where people are free to pull their kids out of public school, or pull themselves out of school, I should say, and choose a different school. And then the schools that are teaching these things go out of business. We're not there yet. We're way far along. We're way far away from that. And so the tactics today are, well, we're forced to pay for this. What type of values and value sets are going to be taught that actually lead to a more liberty loving generation? Well, maybe we should use the only signal that's available to us to put that into the public school system. Yes, it is somewhat against the ultimate principle that we've got, but it is in service of the actual long-term strategy and goal that we have. And it's also just the right thing to do, given what you're forced to be doing. Right? It's like like no one, I mean, this the age old Nazis and Jews hiding on your floorboards. Do you lie to them, sort of thing? It's like, well, yeah, like technically lying is wrong, but there's a greater principle that is being served by that in the long term, which is the health and human flourishing of these people. So, not to totally equate these things, obviously, but it's the same deal. We've got a strategy in principle that we're fighting for. There are tactics for that. This is the only line of attack that we've got to protect children, and it's the only signal that we can give to educators and to the public school system that they should change their ways. Therefore, we should use it.
Absolutely right.
Cool. Well, friends, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it. Again, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really helps us out, and we'll catch you on the next episode.